All right. Well, we're glad you're here. A lot of people still celebrating Christmas and all that good stuff. Glad you're here. We are studying death and beyond. And really, the best way I have found, for at least for me to study, is to ask the question and then come up with the answer. And to teach it that way. That has meant more to me, for me, and hopefully it will for you as well. We've looked at the question, what is death? We looked at the question then, what are we going to be like? We looked at part 3 was, I forgot all of a sudden. Oh, yes. If man dies, shall he live again? Job 14:14. Then and I knew it'd take more than 1 week on this lesson. Where'd we go? Where does the soul go when the body? James says the body and the soul separate. That's death. Where does the soul go? And this is a question that is asked, and we looked last week at 3 things that the scriptures don't teach at all, but have been taught, I guess, for lack of a better term, been taught by individuals for years. And we looked at where it doesn't go. So we want to look at today where it does go. Let me say this as we begin this study today, that this is my understanding. I've done a lot of research on this, and this is my understanding. It may not be yours, and that's fine. And we may even look at things a little differently with regards to what we're going to say today. And that's fine, too, because there's much subjection, I think, in this field. It's kind of interesting. In reading folks, they say, this is the way it is, this is the way it is, this is the way it is. Well, I look at that verse a little different. And so when you study it like that, then you say, well, okay, let's see, we're open for interpretation. It's one of those things, as I've said through this series and still say, this subject is good. It's interesting. I like it. Other people like it. And so it's good from that end. But yet at the same point in time, too, it's not going to affect the salvation of our soul. Really, once we believe that we have a soul and we believe that there is an afterlife, then where are we going to go from the standpoint of how we're going to be and exactly where do we go when we die? Those are questions that they're good to study. They're good to look at because we're going to look at some scriptures and we're going to talk about some things that maybe you've looked at before, maybe you haven't noticed them, and hopefully that will help you in your study. But we looked last week where the soul doesn't go. Soul doesn't go to the grave. In other words, it doesn't, as some call it, soul sleep. It does not go to purgatory, and it does not go evidently directly to heaven. So where does it go? Well, first thing is under Part D on page 1, which should be Part B. My auto numbering didn't work the way I wanted it to work, and I didn't catch it till after it was printed. So anyway, where does the soul go? We're on page 1 at the bottom. Jesus gives us a hint. If you look in Luke chapter 23, we're just going to take our time, look at these verses. If you have anything you want to say, please say it. Add to our thinking and add to our discussion. In Luke chapter 23, verse 43, Jesus is hanging on the cross, and there is a discussion, if you will, while Jesus is hanging on the cross, and it's really between the 2 thieves. Verse 39 says in Luke chapter 23, then one of the criminals who were hanged blasphemed him, saying, if you are the Christ, save yourselves and us. But the other answering rebuked him, saying, do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And that's when Jesus said, assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Now, we're going to put together a jigsaw puzzle this morning for a few minutes at least. when we look at this verse, there's often, or these verses, there's often the discussion of, one was saved and one was not. Well, one, as Luke says, blasphemed, rejected. One confessed, one seemingly turned and acknowledged, what we've done was wrong. And so under the law, under the old law, this was what one must do in order to be forgiven. And so Jesus was able to forgive, if you will, or tell this man, in essence, he has been forgiven. The insight for our study is just Jesus says, okay, today you're going to be with me in paradise. Now we're going to try to nail that down where that is in just a few minutes. But let's just kind of put this jigsaw puzzle together. You'll be with me in paradise, Jesus said. How about John chapter 20 and verse 17? Jesus gives us a little more insight. Jesus in John 20, he's come forth out of the tomb. And in verse 17, well, I tell you what, let's go back to verse 11 so we get the whole flow. Mary stood outside of the tomb weeping. Mary Magdalene had gone to the tomb, and she's outside weeping because, of course, the tomb is empty. She stooped down and looked into the tomb. She saw two angels in white sitting at the head and the other feet where the body of Jesus had lain. Then they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Now, when she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there and did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" She, supposing him to be the gardener, said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you've laid him. I'll take him away." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him, "Rabboni," which is to say, teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God." Okay, so first of all, he told the thief on the cross, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." Now we have him coming forth out of the grave 3 days later, talking to Mary, and notice what he says, "I haven't gone to the Father yet. Don't touch me because I haven't gone to the Father." Well, wait a minute. He went somewhere. Well, he went to paradise. That's where he told the thief that he'd be with him. But he told Mary, "I didn't go to be with the Father yet." Okay, so we're putting this puzzle together. Now let's go to Acts chapter 2. In Acts chapter 2, Jesus gives us another piece of our puzzle. Not really per se Jesus, it's Peter, of course, speaking, but it is about Jesus. This is a quote. Let's go back. We know this is all Peter's sermon. Peter's sermon begins verse 14, but let's not read the whole thing. Let's go back to verse 22. "Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves also know. Him being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God, you've taken by lawless hands, have crucified and put to death, whom God raised up, having loosed the pains of death, because it was not possible that he should be held by it. For David says concerning him, I foresaw the Lord always before my face, for he is at the right hand, that I may not be shaken. Therefore my heart rejoiced, and my tongue was glad. Moreover, my flesh also rest in hope, for you will not leave my soul in Hades, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. You have made known to me the ways of life. You will make me full of joy in your presence. Men and brethren, let me speak freely to you, the patriarch David. And he goes on. But he's using, and yes, this is beginning in verse 25. He's quoting, if you will, from David out of the Psalms. Excuse me. And as he is quoting this passage, he's makes the statement with regards to Jesus. And you can go back and you can read this out of Psalm 16. Jesus was not going to be left in Hades. Now, here's another part of the puzzle. Told the thief, you're going to be with me in paradise. He told Mary he hadn't gone yet to the Father. And Acts 2 says that he went to Hades. So we've got somewhat of an idea of at least Jesus when he died. We're still putting the puzzle together. Anything anybody want to say thus far? Got you all confused. All right. Well, then look in the book of Luke, 16th chapter. Luke chapter 16, beginning in verse 19. This is the story of the rich man and Lazarus. And I think probably the best place to begin is to talk about it a little bit before we actually read it. This has been one of those stories found in the Bible that has been often debated over whether it was a parable or it was an actual occurrence. If you are into reading theology and you read old stuff, and I'm talking about 1800s, early 1900s, some referred to it as this, but you would read, instead of the rich man and Lazarus, you would hear people talk about Dives and Lazarus. Dives is the Latin term for rich or rich man. And if you go back into the Latin text, back into the early times before really the Bible came into being in the form or the 66 books like we have it today, that the Latin Vulgate uses the term that many thought, especially like Martin Luther and others, thought that this was actually the actual name of the rich man, Dives. Our modern versions just translate the Greek word, which is used for rich man, as rich man. But is this a story or is it a parable? Well, if, as some would suppose, that the Latin Vulgate was correct, this is a story that is a parable that has only named people in it, and you will not find another parable as such. You also have seemingly actual occurrences. It seems to be, it reads as if it were a story that actually occurred. I lean in that direction. Now, some say it's a parable. And it's interesting, you know, we studied back first of this year, we studied parables. And I didn't talk about this one because I knew I was going to talk about it when I got to talking about this subject. And when you begin to look at books that just talk about parables, class books or books that have been written through the years, it's interesting because some don't include him to the story and some do. And some that include it say it might have been an actual occurrence. But let us suppose for just a minute that it was a parable. Well, let's think about a parable. What's a parable? Parable's a story. Yes. A parable is a story with a meaning. Yes. A parable is a story with a meaning, but it also holds to the truth, trying to teach the truth. I thought it was interesting. I was reading one book this week on this, and it was kind of interesting because the individual held to it as a parable, but then they took everything else and said, here's the literal. And they talked about it and used the passage from a standpoint of the afterlife. I don't have a problem with that. That may have been what it was. Jesus, though, when he taught a parable, you could take the things, but he talked about real, practical, everyday things. And he gave them, if you will, he gave them life. He talked about the debtor. He talked about the net. He talked about the mustard seed, right? He talked about those things. And he talked about those things that were real and those things that took place. And so if this is a parable, Jesus is still talking about it from the standpoint of here's what here's how it is. Some would look at it from the standpoint it's strictly a parable and therefore it's teaching. Okay, what's it teaching? If you go back to the greater context of the verses, and remember when we studied parables, that's what we tried to do. We tried to find the greater context to understand the lesson that is being taught. And when you look at the greater context, this parable, if you will, fits in then understanding the idea of covetousness and the idea of riches. Yeah, it does that. But it also teaches, like I say, I believe an actual occurrence. Notice how he begins, a certain rich man, a particular. Jesus has in mind a particular individual, not just a rich man, but a certain rich man. So it seems as if Jesus has not only the name Lazarus, but he has a particular incident in mind of what happened. So I say all that to say this. If you want to hold to the fact that it's an actual occurrence, okay, I can give you a lot of people that would agree with that. I lean in that direction myself. If you want to say, no, Brother Paul, it's a parable, okay. What's he really teaching? What's he saying? Well, he's talking about covetousness and riches, yes, but he's talking about where it's going to lead and how it's going to be, right? So either way you look at it, the events in the parable itself or the occurrence have to be true, have to be factual. Now, as you look at this and as we read this story, and I'm just going to refer to it as a story because either way, parable or actual occurrence, it's a story, the way I define story. When you look at this story, look at it from several different angles, not just, well, where are we going to go or where are we going to be when we die? But look at it from the standpoint of what goes on, what takes place, what's happening. I'll kind of point some of those, not all of them, but some of those things out as we look at it. So let's look at the story. Let's read the story. I know you know it. You've read it before, but just humor me, I guess, will be the best way. Just kind of get it fresh in our mind, if you will. There was a certain rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. Rich. This is rich. This is not a man that's poor. This is not a man that's putting on airs. This is a man that truly was rich. He's a particular man, like I said, certain rich man that Jesus has in mind. But there was a certain beggar, particular beggar, notice again, but there's a certain beggar named Lazarus. Lazarus is full of sores, who was laid at his gate, desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. Now, it's not a pretty picture. It's not. It just isn't. When you look at the picture itself, he is hungry. He desires. There's no indication that he necessarily was fed from the crumbs. He desired the crumbs. He's poor. He needs help. Notice that it says that he was laid at his gate. He is dependent upon other individuals. And notice that it says the dogs came and licked his sores. This was the medicine of the day. And that's how you rolled in first century. But yet, kind of interesting thought along this line. Just you might say, well, this has nothing to do with the afterlife, and you're right, but we're just going to try to interpret the whole thing, if you will, as we go through. Dogs in first century were not the domesticated animals we have today that we have in our homes and love, and they were scavengers. And probably some did have pets, but they were scavengers. They roamed the streets, and They were not, like I say, they're not as domesticated as they are today. As we love our animals and should, don't get me wrong. But the dogs came and they licked his sores. So it was, verse 22, that the beggar died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried, and being in torment in Hades. So we have the rich man in Hades. He lifted up his eyes and he saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. Abraham's bosom. Now, I know you're going to say, or you should say, you should ask, well, tell me more about Abraham's bosom. Really can't. Really can't. Place of honor, a place of safety, a place that evidently this Lazarus went. But beyond that, really don't know a lot. Well, we're getting to more. I'm just trying to get through the story first. Then he cried and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. Now, I want you to notice something. I want you to notice that the rich man dies as well, and he's not annihilated. Remember, we said last week there's some that talk about soul sleeping, and then there's some that talk about annihilation. He is very much conscious, if you will. He very much has an awareness. He very much has, if you will, a sense of where he is. And notice that he is not at the Holiday Inn. That's probably the best way I know how to put it. He's in torment, it says. And so all he wants is just if you will, a drop of water to cool my tongue, for I'm tormented in this flame. But Abraham said, Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things. But now he is comforted, and you are tormented. You switched. Now, why did they switch? It has to be that we have to go beyond, say, this text to say, well, evidently Lazarus was a man that was following God, and the rich man was not. Now you say, well, that's not in the text, and that's right, it's not. But we would figure that out, if you will, through the study of other scriptures, which you've done before. But notice what he says. He says, man, in your life, you had good things. Lazarus had evil things. And he says, no, it's switched. And besides all this, between us and you, there's a great gulf that's fixed, so that those who want to pass from here to you cannot, nor can those from there pass to us. There's a gulf. So you have torment in this realm, and you also not only have torment, but you have that which seemingly is good. You have Lazarus in what is good. You also have a gulf. And then he said, I beg you therefore, Father, that you would send him to my father's house. For I have 5 brothers, that he may testify to them, lest they also come to this place of torment. He couldn't get out. Now, it's interesting because here's what he's saying. Lord, I'm in a bad situation. And I can't get out. But if you can send him, well, evidently he can't get out. But if you could send him back home to my family, and they could tell my family how terrible this place is, so that they will avoid it. The answer is interesting because Abraham said they have Moses and the prophets. They have the truth for that time being taught. And why I say for that time, because remember, it's not going to be long from Luke 16. Jesus is going to die on the cross. But up until that point, they were under the old law, and they had to follow the old law. And so they have Moses, they have the prophets. Let them listen to the teaching of God. Let them listen to the preaching of God. And he said, no, Father Abraham, But if one goes to them from the dead, they will repent. Now on the surface, that sounds good. Lord, they're not going to listen to the prophets. They're not going to listen to Moses. But man, if somebody goes back from the dead and tells them how it is, they'll listen and they'll believe. But, verse 31, he said to them, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded though one rise from the dead. He said, if they won't listen to Moses and the prophets, they won't listen to anybody. We've said through the years, well, if somebody come back from the dead, it would persuade people. Or if we had somebody that could just tell the story. The Lord says, we've got the truth. That's all we need. People need to listen to it. No testimony of anybody coming back is really going to satisfy what they need. They just need to listen to Moses and the prophets. But if they won't even listen to Moses and the prophets, if they won't listen to the truth, if they won't listen to the preaching that's there, he said they're not going to hear what is said from the standpoint. They're not going to listen to somebody though they've come from the dead. Straightforward. Anything about the story anybody wants to say? Okay. Well, then look at under part 3 on page. This is a chart. I've had this chart forever. I have found this chart. I think I told you last week. I found it in my files about the same way, but about 3 or 4 different ways. I mean, it had the same information really diagrammed the same way, but they've done it a little differently. This is, for me, this is, like I say, I've had this forever, but it's the easiest one that even amongst the 3 or 4 that I have, it's still the easiest one to look at and to understand and to try to figure out what we're talking about. Try to add to our puzzle, try to put together our puzzle. So let's do that. In this diagram, we've kind of got the puzzle that Jesus helped us fix with regards to the thief and Mary, and also what Acts 2 added to with regards to Jesus evidently went to Hades. Then we have the story of the rich man and Lazarus. So we have several pieces here. Now let's put them together. Well, this diagram, or this, if you will, and this probably, I'm guessing, I don't really know where I do know where I got it. I got it actually from Leo Powers many years ago. I was in college at the time, but it probably came off of some remember the old bed sheet sermons that preachers used to preach, especially in gospel meetings. It probably came off of that originally, and so I can't give credit to it from the standpoint. I will tell you this: I didn't come up with this chart. But I do think that this kind of puts the puzzle together that helps us. Let's look at it. If you look at the very left side, you have birth. In other words, this is when we're born, when we come to this world. We enter into then the first state. That's where the spirit is in the body. When God breathed into man the breath of life and he became a living soul. Well, when we become alive, if you will. When is that? I believe it's at conception. You may not. I believe that. I believe the Bible teaches that. I believe science shows it. I believe that if people would be honest, look at it, that's just fact. It is that point in time. And then you say, of course, we come out of the birth canal, we're born, we walk, we eat, we breathe, we sleep. Life. That's the first state. That's where we are. That's the here and now, if you will. Saints and sinners, if you look in that first state, saints and sinners, that's all of us. That's this world. That's where we are, who we are. Then we die. We take our last breath. You've probably, if you haven't, you're fortunate, you're blessed, but you've probably sat at the bedside of someone as they've taken their last breath. I've done it quite a few times. It's never enjoyable. It's never fun. But we take our last breath, we die. Well, where do we go? Well, Jesus sort of helped us with this. We have the second state. In the Hebrew text, the Old Testament, if you will, this second state is referred to as Sheol. And when you look at Sheol, if you look down if you keep going under your chart and look at A1, then you look 2, Sheol simply means the grave. It can also mean cavity. You also have in the New Testament, in the Greek, you have the word Hades. Now, let me say a couple of things about Hades, or about translations, and that will include this idea of Hades. Our more modern translations are more consistent than what we refer to as the King James, the old King James. I'm not condemning the old King James, grew up on the old King James. I use the new King James. But it's interesting because the King James, we talk about the 16, we don't use the 1605 edition. We actually, the King James that so many of us grew up on was actually the 1739 edition. The King James version itself's gone through 9 revisions. And so when you talk about the old King James, it's not the oldest and it's not the newest. Now, like I say, I use the New King James Version because it doesn't use the these and the thous, and it doesn't use the for lack of a better term, the archaic language of that was used in the 1739 edition. It just doesn't. There are really a lot of good translations, and this is not a class on translations nor time for translations. But in the old King James Version, when you read the word hell, you really had to go to your footnotes because sometimes it referred to Hades, and sometimes, as we'll see in just a minute, it referred to Gehenna. And you'd have to read your footnotes in your Bible, and it would tell you there. But sometimes it translated one and one the other. The newer versions that you find, like the New King James and the ESV and New American Standard, are more consistent. Hades is translated Hades, and Gehenna is translated hell. Well, what's the difference? Well, let's look at this second state for a minute. So you have Sheol, which is the grave, and then you also have Hades, which is just simply a place for it literally is the idea of departed spirits, is the term. Well, you have evidently 2 places. Suzanne just asked us about could Abraham's bosom be paradise? Probably so. You have paradise. Jesus told the thief on the cross, today you're going to be with me in paradise. Acts 2 said that he went to Hades. David had prophesied, Psalm 16, you're going to paradise. You're going to Hades. So Hades must be where Jesus went, and there must have been a place called paradise. Is that where Lazarus was? Seemingly so. But then there was torment. There's a place called Tartarus. Tartarus, some call it Tartarus, but Tartarus is also, if you go to 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, if you want to turn there with me, 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. God did not spare the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them to the chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. The word hell there is actually the word Tartarus. They went to Tartarus. Okay. Well, where is Tartarus? Well, evidently it's where the rich man was. Now, in between the paradise and Tartarus, you have that great gulf. That great gulf that, remember in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, that Abraham said, there's a gulf between the two and we can't cross over. This diagram, like I say, this is not my diagram, but it really holds true if you stop and think about it. Look at the gulf, this great gulf, whatever it was, this great expanse was a divider wherein you could not cross. Sometimes when I am lost in my own thinking and driving down the road and driving down the interstate, sometimes as they're working on bridges, how they'll go from 2 lanes to one and they have those concrete dividers and you can't, they've got it fixed, which I don't blame them, but they've got it fixed where if you were to stay in the left lane, you would hit those dividers. And if as you move over to the right, as you travel, you can't go to the left any further than those concrete dividers. That's to keep you off the workers. And like I say, I don't blame them for fixing that like that. That's the divide. You can't divide that great gulf. But if you notice and you look at this diagram, the great gulf, you'd say, well, preacher, you got it in the first state. Yeah. Think about it. People make choices. And sometimes they will die in their choices, even when they realize they're wrong. The difference, though, if you look at that gulf that's in the first state, you can still get around it. In the second state, it fills up the whole state. You cannot go across it. And I like that idea because I have talked to so many people that in the state that we're in, the first state, they don't want to hear the gospel. They don't want to hear the truth. They have made their decision. They are hardened in that decision. They're not going to change that decision. It is what it is. I will die in this state. This is the way mama believed or daddy believed or great grandmama believed, and I'm going to die right there like it. Okay. You can still make that change. You still are alive. You can still listen and you can still do what God's. No, I'm not going. Okay. But notice that they still could get around. That's why it's drawn this way. And it's just an interesting phenomenon, but yet it's kind of the way it is. Yeah. Thank you. It's not my drawing. So then you have, if you go back to the diagram, the drawing, you see the resurrection and the judgment. Well, we know this class is not for the purpose of talking about the resurrection and the judgment, but we know the Lord's coming again. We know that there's going to be the resurrection of the dead. The living will be changed, according to 1 Corinthians 15, and the Lord will come again, and judgment will take place. It is then at judgment that we go into the third state. Eternity, it calls it, the diagram that is, and notice that it calls it heaven, and then it calls it hell. Hell is the lake of fire. If you have a version that footnotes still, and it says Gehenna, you might say, what in the world is Gehenna? Gehenna is actually a compound word. Ge meaning, or actually, let me go back. Actually, in the Greek, it's gi. It means land. Hinnon was an actual place. Hinnon was the garbage dump of its day. Hinnon was where Moloch, the god Moloch, people had raised. Moloch was a statue, if you will, that was sitting down but had arms that extended out. Underneath the arms, there was a constant fire. And the people of that day that believed in Moloch would take their babies and throw them into the red hot arms of this god as a sacrifice to appease him for his anger. Now they did that where? In Gehenna, the land of Hinnon. As we said, Gehenna was also the garbage dump. The garbage dump in that day, there was a constant fire trying to get rid of all the garbage that was there. People of the first century understood Gehenna as being a place of utter torment, being a place of utter disgust. And so, in biblical times, just as in our day, we search for words to help people get the association together. That the most vile and disgusting of places is used, that term is still used, the land of Hinnom. Okay, disgusting place. That's hell. That's hell. Now, having said that, we then say, okay, why is there a need for a resurrection and judgment? If the second state, we're already divided as the rich man and Lazarus was, why is there a need for the third state? Well, the best that I can answer that is this, and this answer came from years ago. Guyan Woods wrote a book entitled Questions and Answers Open Forum, which is actually an answers that he gave at Freed-Hardeman in the Open Forum back in the 70s, I believe. But it makes the most sense to me. And that is that in our own judicial system, a man may go to court, woman for that matter, go to court, have a trial, be convicted in the trial, told that they will be sentenced, but be sentenced at a later date. Usually the trial is about conviction or innocence. And then sentencing is at a later date. They're already in jail. And so consequently, waiting for their judgment. Well, you might say, well, preacher, the individual that's in paradise is not in jail. That's right. But they are in what we would say is the equivalent of heaven. Is it heaven itself? Don't think so. Because remember what Jesus told Mary. He said, I have not yet ascended to the Father. Now, you can disagree with that, and you have every right, and I have no problem with you disagreeing with that. But that's, as I have put it together, that's the best that I can come up with. Any questions, comments, thoughts, suggestions? Oh, sure, and I do too, and I may not can answer what you're going to ask. Mm-hmm. Well, I stole it from somebody. First of all, I think it is because I think even in that story, I think Jesus had in mind a particular man because of the word certain, the Greek word. It's the idea of a particular. In other words, I can tell you a story. Well, I'll use a particular instance. I sat in membership committee Sunday night or Wednesday night, and I made a general statement. I said I can name names, but I'm not with regards to a situation. And that's the answer to that one that I hold. Well, I'm not saying it's true, but that's why I made the statement. But yeah, you're right. Yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Pharisees. Yeah. Sure, sure. So here would be my answer to that for my own good is that I believe Jesus uses hyperbole. I think you used a really good example of that. What are you going to do with the things that are found in the story? What are you going to do? What are you going to do with the fact that there is an afterlife? What are you going to do with the fact that there is a place where the rich man went and Lazarus went, and they were two different separate places? What are you going to do with the fact that there was a consciousness there? What are you going to do with the facts of the story, just like you do with the facts of any of the parables? What are you going to do with them? And that's where I have to try to fit it into that puzzle. So then when we so then when we get to that question of will we know one another, will we recognize and know one another, which is probably next week's lesson. One of the things that you have to take into account is what God can give you and what God will give you. And the presence, if the Lord is in Hades, he would have been as well in a place of consciousness, evidently. And wouldn't he have been saddened by the number of people that did not listen to him that he would have not seen there? Yeah. 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 Now, I think we'll have memory, and I struggle with this one. Okay, I'm going to give an answer to that question here in subsequent weeks, but I do struggle with it because there are aunts and uncles that if everything I read in the Bible is as it is, and I believe that it is, or I wouldn't be teaching it and following it, I don't hold much hope for them. Now, I leave that in the hands of God. I'm going to leave that in the hands of God. But how, if they're not there, uh, members of the church, I've preached for 39 years, be 40 in May, and I've taught a lot of people, sat under a lot of, put my feet under a lot of folks' table, and when you put it under their table, you get to know them real well and love them dearly. Now, some I could do without, but I love them dearly, and they're not going to be there. And so what's going to be, how am I going to be joyful in a place where they're not going to be? Well, first of all, then you're saying that I can't be joyful at all where I am. Second of all, you're saying, well, God can't, God can't remove us from the standpoint of our sorrow. Matter of fact, what does Revelation 21 say? No more tears. And so you have to balance all that. You don't believe that. Okay. Here's where I would ultimately want people to come down on. There is a judgment. There is going to be a resurrection, then a judgment. There's an eternity. There's a heaven. There's a hell. God will send you to hell. But really, when we say that, that's not really true. We send ourselves to hell. The judgment is passed upon. Here's what you did. And those that do these, this is where they're going. So we've done it to ourselves, not God. And if we can believe in eternity, we may not believe this. We may not believe exactly how it's going to be. But if we can believe in a heaven and believe in a hell, and by all means try to avoid hell, and by all means try to do what God has told us to do in order that heaven may be ours. think about it for my own personal reading. Friday. I read Romans chapters 1 through 5. And I came across something, if you don't mind looking at it with me right quick. I came across something that I know I've preached on it, but I've never thought about it as such as I did Friday. In Romans chapter 2, verse 5, it says, "But in accordance with your hardness and impenitent heart, you are treasuring up for yourselves wrath in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render to each man according to his deeds eternal life to those who by patient continuance in doing good seek for glory, honor, and immortality." Did you catch what he said there in verse 7? Seek. Are you in this life seeking glory? What's glory? Well, there's two types of glory: the glory of living the Christian life and glory of hearing the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." I'm going to preach on this sometime this coming year. I don't know when. But then there's honor, the honor of once again, living the way God would have you to live. And then immortality, living forever. What are you seeking? That's the question, and that's what I hope people will ultimately answer. Maybe maybe I'm all wrong, but I hope to goodness I'm seeking glory and honor and immortality, and I hope you are too. Anything else? Well, George is finished, so I better be finished. Let's pray right quick. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this day, for the blessing of it, for the opportunity to study your word, for the fact that it is lamp to our feet and light to our path, and for the fact that we do know that based upon what you have given to us, that there is a heaven, there is a hell. May we ever live with you, close to you, near to you, be an example to others so that in the end we can hear the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Be with us, watch over us, bless us, and keep us, and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Thank y'all.